Hey everyone, I hope you enjoy this. If you do, feel free to let me know your thoughts. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. Wishing you a great time watching. Hey Reddit, this is going to be a heavy post, and I honestly don't even know how to process everything I've been through these past few days. I'm hoping writing it out here will help me make sense of it, or at least give someone out there a heads up about the curveballs life can throw. To start, my wife, Laura, and I have been married for 25 years. We met when I was 28 and she was 26. She was smart, funny, and could light up a room with her laugh. For the longest time, I thought we were solid, like the unshakable kind of solid. We had our ups and downs, sure, but what marriage doesn't? She was diagnosed with cancer 3 years ago. Watching her fight was the hardest thing I've ever had to endure. Laura was a warrior in every sense, determined not to let the illness define her. She went through treatment after treatment, keeping her sense of humor intact even on the worst days. When hospice became the reality, I never left her side. Her passing 3 weeks ago left me gutted. I've been wandering through life in a haze, trying to keep it together for our 2 kids, who are grown but still need their dad right now. After her funeral, I was cleaning out her belongings when I stumbled upon an envelope labeled "For You." Her handwriting was unmistakable, and for a moment, I froze. I thought it might be a love letter or maybe some final words of encouragement to help me cope with the loss. Instead, it was a confession, a bombshell that shattered the foundation of everything I thought I knew about her and our marriage. She had been unfaithful. Not recently, not in the past decade, but 17 years ago when I was 34 and she was 33. The affair lasted a little over a year. The man? Someone I didn't know personally, but who worked in her office back then. A colleague she referred to in her letter as Kevin. Laura admitted it ended when she transferred to another department, and she swore she'd never looked back or made contact with him again. The letter explained everything. How it started, the lies she told to keep it hidden, and how she made the decision to bury it in the past. She claimed she loved me the whole time and that the affair was her way of acting out during a difficult period in our marriage when I was consumed by work and she felt neglected. She ended the letter by saying she hoped I'd forgive her and remember her for the life we built together, not the mistakes she made. When I finished reading, I couldn't breathe. My heart felt like it had been ripped out of my chest and stomped on. I sat in silence for what must have been hours, rereading the letter, trying to reconcile the Laura I knew with the Laura who had lived with this secret for nearly 2 decades. I didn't eat. I didn't sleep. For 3 straight days, I couldn't form a coherent thought. I'd look at our wedding photos, at the pictures of us with our kids, and wonder if it was all a lie. Had she ever truly loved me? Or was it all just guilt and self-preservation wrapped up in years of pretending? And then came the questions that wouldn't stop spinning in my mind. Should I have known? Were there signs I missed? What was I doing back then that made her feel like she had to turn to someone else? After reading her letter, I started sifting through my memories, trying to piece together the cracks that must have existed back then. Hindsight's a cruel thing. It shines a spotlight on moments you dismissed at the time, but now can't unsee. Back then, I was working insane hours. I just made partner in my firm, which meant long nights at the office and weekend meetings with clients. I'd leave early, come home late, and collapse in a bed without much left to give emotionally. Laura, meanwhile, was dealing with 2 toddlers, a stressful job of her own, and apparently the weight of feeling invisible in her own marriage. Were there signs? Maybe. She started working late more often, claiming she needed to catch up on projects. I never doubted her. I mean, why would I? She wasn't the kind of person to lie. At least, that's what I thought. And then there was the sudden interest in her appearance. She bought new clothes, started wearing makeup more often, and even joined a gym. She told me it was for herself, that she wanted to feel good about her body after having the kids. It made sense, and I was happy for her. But now I'm questioning everything. I remember one night vividly. It was a Friday, and I'd come home early to surprise her with dinner and a bottle of wine. When I walked through the door, she wasn't there. The sitter said she had a work meeting that ran late. I shrugged it off, put the kids to bed, and waited up for her. When she came home around 10, she seemed flustered. I asked her how the meeting went, and she snapped at me, saying I didn't understand how stressful her job was. It turned into an argument. and I ended up sleeping on the couch. At the time, I chalked it up to exhaustion, hers and mine. But now, with her confession, I wonder if that was one of those nights. Was she really at work, or was she with him? The memories wouldn't stop flooding back, each one carrying a new layer of doubt. I felt like I was watching the reel of our life play backward, catching glimpses of a version of her I didn't know existed. And the lies. God, the lies. The thought that she'd looked me in the eyes, kissed me goodnight, and told me she loved me, all while keeping this massive secret. It broke something inside me. But then I thought about the years that followed. Laura was a great wife and an incredible mother. Could someone who'd betrayed me so deeply also love me so fully? It felt like trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces, and I wasn't sure if I even wanted to find them. Laura didn't give many details about Kevin in her letter, but that didn't stop my mind from running wild. Who was this guy? What did he have that I didn't? Was he married too? Did he know about me and the kids? Did he laugh behind my back every time I dropped Laura off at her office? I couldn't let it go. I needed to know more. I didn't want to dredge up the past, but I also couldn't move forward without answers. So I went digging. First, I went through Laura's old work files. Most of it was boring stuff, meeting notes, invoices, and drafts of presentations. But then I found a group photo from a holiday party. I scanned each face, trying to match a name to the shadowy figure haunting my imagination. And there he was, Kevin. He wasn't remarkable in any way. Mid-30s, average build, forgettable face. He was standing near Laura, his arm draped casually over the back of her chair. There was nothing outwardly suspicious about the photo, but the way Laura was smiling. Wide, bright, almost too much, it hit me like a punch to the gut. I flipped the photo over. Someone had scrawled a note in pen. Holiday party, 2007. Great times. That was the year. The year she cheated. My stomach churned. I stared at Kevin's face for what felt like hours, burning it into my memory. He wasn't just a random coworker anymore. He was the guy. The one who'd shared moments with my wife that I thought belonged only to me. For days, I debated whether to dig further. A part of me felt like knowing more would only deepen the wound. But another part, the part that couldn't stop imagining their affair, needed to understand the full scope of what had happened. So, I did the one thing I promised myself I wouldn't do. I called Laura's old colleague, Kathy. Kathy had been Laura's friend at work, someone she always spoke highly of. I wasn't sure if she'd tell me anything, but I figured it was worth a shot. When she picked up, her voice was warm, almost cheerful. "Hey, Kathy, it's Mark," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I hope I'm not bothering you. I had a question about Laura's time at work, back in the mid-2000s. There was a pause. Then, softly, "Mark, is everything okay?" I told her about the letter, leaving out some of the grittier details, but making it clear that I knew about the affair. Kathy let out a heavy sigh, and I could almost hear her debating whether to say anything. "I always liked you, Mark," she finally said. "You were a good husband to Laura. You didn't deserve this." That confirmed it. She knew. Kathy hesitated, then continued. "Kevin was charming, I guess. Everyone in the office liked him. He was the kind of guy who could make you feel like the only person in the room. Laura was going through a tough time, and well, I guess he was there for her in ways you weren't." Her words stung, but I let her keep talking. "It wasn't just Laura," Kathy added, her voice tinged with disgust. "Kevin had a reputation. He flirted with everyone. But I guess Laura was the one he really went after. It wasn't my place to say anything back then, but I always felt bad for you." I thanked her and hung up, feeling like the air had been sucked out of my lungs. So, Kevin wasn't just Kevin. He was a predator, someone who preyed on vulnerable women like Laura. But did that make what she did any less of a betrayal? I stared at that holiday party photo again, now knowing the kind of man Kevin was. It didn't bring me any closure. If anything, it made me angrier. I wanted to scream at her, even though she wasn't here to hear it. Why didn't she tell me? Why didn't she give me a chance to fight for us back then? Instead, she gave Kevin a piece of her she could never give back. After talking to Kathy, I fell into a fog. I couldn't focus on work, couldn't eat, couldn't even bring myself to talk to my kids. For 3 days, I shut myself off from the world, pacing the house like a ghost. I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. Laura's confession, Kathy's words, Kevin's smirking face from that photo. I tried to talk myself out of it, to rationalize what Laura had written. She was gone. What good would it do to dig into the past? But every time I thought about letting it go, the anger bubbled up again. The silence in the house didn't help. Since Laura's passing, it had felt hollow, like the walls were holding their breath. Now, it felt like the house itself was taunting me. Every picture on the mantel, every piece of furniture we'd picked out together, they were all reminders of a life that felt like a lie. On the second night, I grabbed a bottle of whiskey from the cabinet and sat on the back porch, staring at the yard where we used to have summer barbecues. The kids' old swing set was still there, rusting quietly in the corner. I poured a glass and stared at the sky, the stars offering no answers. I thought about Laura, the woman I'd loved and devoted my life to, and I felt a wave of grief, so raw it almost knocked me over. Why? I whispered into the night. Why didn't you tell me when you were alive? I wanted to hate her, but I couldn't. Not entirely. She'd been my partner, my best friend. She'd held my hand through some of the toughest moments of my life. How could someone who'd given me so much also take so much away? On the third day, I realized I couldn't keep this to myself anymore. I needed to talk to someone, anyone, before the silence swallowed me whole. So, I called my brother Jason. Jason's the kind of guy who can find humor in anything, but when he heard the tremble in my voice, he didn't crack a single joke. I told him everything about Laura's letter, the affair, Kevin, all of it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before he finally spoke. Man, he said softly, I don't even know what to say. Join the club, I muttered, rubbing my temples. You don't have to figure this out all at once, Jason said. You just lost her, and now you're dealing with this on top of it? That's too much for anyone. You need time to process, to grieve. But how do I grieve her when I'm so angry? I asked, my voice cracking. How do I forgive someone who isn't even here to apologize? Jason sighed. I don't know, Mark, but I do know this. You've got 2 kids who need you right now, and you can't let this break you. If you want to figure out what this all means, fine, but don't let it ruin what you've still got. His words hit me harder than I expected. He was right. Laura was gone, but the kids were still here. My life wasn't over, even if it felt like it. That night, I made myself a promise. I wouldn't let Laura's secret destroy me. I didn't know how I was going to move forward, but I knew I had to try. After my conversation with Jason, I tried to pull myself together. But every time I looked at my kids, I felt like I was walking around with this massive secret pressing down on me. I'd glance at Olivia, my 22-year-old daughter who'd inherited Laura's smile, or Jacob, my 19-year-old son who had Laura's sharp sense of humor, and the weight of what I knew became unbearable. Should I tell them? On one hand, they deserved to know the truth about their mother. They'd just lost her, and I hated the idea of them idolizing someone who'd kept such a monumental secret. But on the other hand, what good would it do? Would knowing tarnish their memories of her? Would it ruin the way they viewed our family? I wrestled with these questions for days. One evening, Olivia came over for dinner. She'd been checking in on me a lot since Laura passed, her concern obvious even when she tried to hide it. She found me in the kitchen, poking at a pot of spaghetti I'd barely had the energy to make. Dad, you okay? She asked, leaning against the counter. I forced a smile. Yeah, just tired, I guess. You've been tired a lot lately, she said, narrowing her eyes. What's going on? For a moment, I thought about telling her everything. The words were on the tip of my tongue. But then I looked at her, her eyes filled with worry, her shoulders tense from carrying her own grief, and I couldn't do it. Not yet. Just trying to figure things out, I said vaguely. She nodded, but I could tell she didn't believe me. After dinner, we sat in the living room, scrolling through old photo albums. It had been her idea, a way to honor Mom, she'd said. As we flipped through pictures of birthdays, vacations, and lazy Sundays, I couldn't help but notice how happy Laura looked in every photo. Had she been faking it? Or had she truly moved past the affair, like she claimed in her letter? Mom was really something, wasn't she? Olivia said, her voice soft. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. Yes, she was. Jacob showed up the next day, dropping by unannounced with a 6-pack of beer and a bag of takeout. He didn't say much, just plopped down on the couch and turned on a baseball game. Thought you could use some company, he said, cracking open a beer and handing one to me. Thanks, kiddo, I said, managing a small smile. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the game and eating burgers. I realized then how much they both reminded me of Laura, not just in the way they looked, but in the way they carried themselves. Olivia's fierce determination. Jacob's quiet thoughtfulness. They'd lost their mother, but they still had parts of her in them. And I wasn't sure if I had the right to shatter that connection by revealing her betrayal. By the end of the night, I'd made my decision. For now, the truth would stay with me. They didn't need to carry this burden. Not yet. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that hiding it from them might only make things worse in the long run, that a week after deciding to keep the truth from Olivia and Jacob, for the time being, at least, I received a letter in the mail. I assumed it was another condolence card, one of many that had been trickling in from friends and distant relatives since Laura's funeral. But when I opened it, my heart sank. The letter was from Kevin. It was typed, brief, and clinical, with no return address. The words were like ice on my skin. Asterisk mark, I know Laura told you about us. I want to express my deepest regrets for what happened all those years ago. It wasn't fair to you, and it wasn't fair to her. I didn't want to intrude on your grief, but I thought it was important for you to hear from me directly. If you'd like to talk, here's my number. Take care. Kevin asterisk. Beneath his signature was a phone number, handwritten in neat, unassuming digits. I stared at the letter for what felt like an eternity, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. Anger was the loudest. How dare he reach out now? After all these years, after Laura's gone? What was he hoping to accomplish? Closure? Forgiveness? Did he expect me to shake his hand and tell him all was forgiven? I crumpled the letter and threw it into the trash. But as the night wore on, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Did I really want to ignore him? A part of me, a very small, reluctant part, wanted answers. I fished the letter out of the trash around midnight, smoothing it out on the kitchen counter. Kevin's number stared back at me like a dare. The next morning I called him. The phone rang twice before he answered. Hello. His voice was calm, polite, like he had no idea he was about to speak to the husband of the woman he'd betrayed with. This is Mark, I said flatly. There was a long pause. I could hear him exhale slowly, like he was bracing himself. Mark, he said finally, thank you for calling. I wasn't sure if you would. Yeah, well, I wasn't sure if I should, I replied, my tone sharp. What do you want, Kevin? He cleared his throat. I wanted to apologize. To acknowledge the hurt I caused you and Laura. I know it's too late to change anything, but I felt it was the right thing to do. The right thing to do? I repeated, my voice rising. The right thing to do would have been to stay the hell away from my wife. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was quieter. You're right. I was selfish. I took advantage of a situation I never should have been part of. And I've regretted it every day since. Regret doesn't undo what you did, I said bitterly. No, it doesn't, he admitted. But I wanted you to know that it wasn't meaningless. I cared about her, Mark, and I believe she cared about you. She loved you. She talked about you all the time. I clenched my jaw, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. Don't talk to me about my wife. You don't get to do that. I'm sorry, he said quickly. I thought you want to know that she didn't take any of it lightly. She was conflicted, torn. I snapped. She wasn't torn enough to stop herself? Was she? Kevin sighed. No, she wasn't. And that's on both of us. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For whatever it's worth. It wasn't worth anything. But before I could tell him that, I hung up. I dropped the phone onto the counter and leaned against the wall, my head spinning. Kevin's words didn't bring clarity or peace. If anything, they left me angrier, more confused. Was Laura conflicted? Did she regret it? Or was Kevin just trying to make himself feel better? The answers felt further away than ever. After the call with Kevin, I spent the rest of the day in a haze. His words kept playing in my head, especially the part where he said Laura talked about me all the time. Did she really love me, even while betraying me? Could love and betrayal coexist like that? I didn't know how to reconcile it, and the uncertainty was eating me alive. That night, I decided to dive deeper into Laura's things. Maybe it was masochistic, but I felt like I needed to find something, anything, that could help me understand the person she'd been during that time. I went through her desk drawers, her nightstand, even the storage bins she kept in the closet. At first, it was just old bills, receipts, and greeting cards. But then, tucked under a pile of notebooks, I found a leather-bound journal. I hadn't known Laura kept a journal, and for a moment, I hesitated. It felt invasive, like I was prying into a part of her life she'd never intended to share. But then I remembered her letter, the one she'd left for me knowing full well it would devastate me. She'd opened this door, and I needed to walk through it. I flipped through the journal, scanning pages filled with her neat, looping handwriting. Most of it was mundane, lists of things to do, reflections on her day, little notes about the kids. But then about a third of the way in, I found it. The first entry was dated 17 years ago, during the year of her affair. I don't know how I got here. I love Mark. I do, but I feel like we've lost each other. He's always working, and when he's home, it's like he's somewhere else entirely. I've tried to talk to him, but he just doesn't see it. I feel invisible. I felt a pang of guilt reading that. I remembered that time in our marriage, how I'd thrown myself into my career, convinced I was doing it all for our family. But I hadn't seen what it was costing us. I kept reading, and as I did, the entries grew darker. Kevin makes me feel seen. He listens. He makes me laugh. It's wrong, I know it's wrong, but I can't stop. I've crossed a line, and I don't know how to go back. Each entry was like a dagger to the heart. She wrote about the guilt she felt, about how she'd come home from being with Kevin and lie awake at night, hating herself. But she also wrote about how alive he made her feel, how he filled a void she thought would never be filled. Then, near the end of that year, the entry shifted again. I told Kevin it has to stop. I can't do this anymore. I can't keep lying to Mark, to myself. I thought it would be easy to let him go, but it's not. I see him at work every day, and it hurts. But I know it's the right thing. Mark doesn't deserve this. He never did. Her last entry about the affair was dated a few months later. It's over. Truly over. I've transferred to a different department, and I haven't spoken to Kevin in weeks. I feel lighter, like I can finally breathe again. Mark doesn't know, and I'll never tell him. It's my burden to carry, not his. I just hope I can make it up to him somehow. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. It didn't erase what she'd done, but it gave me something I hadn't had before. Context. She hadn't cheated out of malice or indifference. She'd cheated because she was lost, and because I wasn't there to guide her back. It didn't justify her actions, but it made them feel human. And for the first time since her confession, I felt something other than anger. I felt sadness. For her. For us. For the life we could have had if we'd just found a way to reach each other before it was too late. After reading the journal, I sat on the floor of our bedroom, the journal still clutched in my hands. I didn't know what to do with everything I'd learned. Laura's entries had stirred something deep inside me, a conflicted mix of anger, sorrow, and, oddly enough, empathy. For 17 years, she'd carried this guilt alone. She'd made the choice to stay, to end things with Kevin, and rebuild what we had. Did that count for something? Should it? The next day, I decided to clear my head with a walk. There's a small park near our house where Laura and I used to take the kids when they were little. It was quiet, peaceful, the kind of place that forces you to sit with your thoughts whether you want to or not. I found myself replaying moments from our marriage. Good ones, bad ones, all of it. I thought about the way she used to laugh at my dumb jokes, how she'd insist on dancing in the kitchen while dinner simmered on the stove. I thought about the late nights we spent comforting crying babies, the vacations where everything went wrong, but we still managed to have fun. And then, inevitably, I thought about Kevin. It was impossible not to picture them together. I hated that my mind went there, hated that those images felt like they were burned into my brain, even though I'd never seen them. What hurt most wasn't just the betrayal itself. It was the fact that she'd shared pieces of herself with him that I thought were mine alone. But then I thought about what she wrote in her journal, about her choice to stay and her effort to make amends in her own way. It didn't erase the betrayal, but it made me question whether I could find it in me to forgive her. Forgiveness felt like a mountain I wasn't sure I could climb. When I got home, I went to our bookshelf and pulled down an old photo album. Inside were pictures from the year of the affair. The same year I now couldn't stop fixating on. There we were, smiling on Christmas morning as the kids tore into their presents. There we were at Olivia's third birthday party, her face covered in cake while Laura laughed beside her. And there we were on a family camping trip, Laura snuggled up next to me by the fire, her head resting on my shoulder. I stared at the pictures, trying to reconcile the woman in them with the woman who had written those journal entries. She looked happy, content. Was it all an act? Or was it possible for someone to feel both joy and regret, love and guilt, all at once? My phone buzzed, breaking me out of my thoughts. It was a text from Olivia. "Hey Dad, thinking of you. Let me know if you want company tonight." I smiled, grateful for her thoughtfulness. "Thanks, sweetie. I'm okay for now, but I'll let you know," I replied. After I set my phone down, I stared at the photo album again. Maybe Jason was right. Maybe I didn't have to figure this all out at once. Forgiveness wasn't something I could force. It had to come naturally, if it came at all. For now, I decided to focus on what I still had, my kids, my memories, and the strength to keep moving forward. Over the next few days, I felt like I was walking a tightrope, balancing between the anger that still simmered inside me and the faint glimmers of forgiveness I was trying to nurture. But something kept gnawing at me. Laura and I never got to have this conversation. If she were alive, what would I have said to her? Would I have shouted, cried, demanded answers? Or would I have sat quietly, letting her explain in her own words? The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't let this go without some kind of resolution. But how do you have a conversation with someone who's no longer here? That night, I pulled Laura's letter out of the drawer where I'd hidden it. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared so many meals and heart-to-hearts over the years. I unfolded the letter, smoothing out its creases, and read it again. "I hope you can forgive me." Those words lingered in my mind like a challenge. I grabbed a notebook and a pen, unsure of what I was doing, but feeling compelled to do something. I started writing, as if I were speaking directly to her. "Laura, I don't even know where to begin. I've spent weeks trying to make sense of everything you told me, and I still don't have the answers. I don't know if I'll ever have them." The words spilled out faster than I expected, each sentence pulling another one along like a thread unraveling a tightly wound spool. "You say you loved me, that you always loved me. But how could you do this to me if you did? How could you look me in the eyes, kiss me goodnight, and tell me you loved me while carrying this secret? Was it guilt that made you stay, or was it love? I need to know. I need to understand." I paused, staring at the page. Did I even want the answers? But the questions kept coming. Was I really that blind back then? Was I so caught up in work, in trying to be a good provider, that I missed what you needed from me? And if I had been more present, would it have made a difference? Tears blurred my vision, but I kept writing. "I want to hate you, but I can't. I want to forgive you, but I'm not there yet. All I can do is hold on to the memories, the good ones, and hope they're enough to remind me of the woman I fell in love with, the woman I thought I knew. Maybe someday I'll find peace with this, but right now, all I feel is pain." I set the pen down, my hand aching from gripping it so tightly. The notebook stared back at me, its pages filled with raw, unfiltered emotions I hadn't been able to voice until now. I didn't feel better, not exactly. But I felt something shift, like I'd taken the first step toward understanding this new reality. I left the notebook open on the table and went to bed, unsure if I'd ever look at it again. That a week after writing that letter to Laura, I decided to visit her grave. I hadn't been back since the funeral, partly because I wasn't sure how I'd feel standing there with so much unresolved between us. But that morning, as I sipped my coffee and stared out the window, something inside me urged me to go. I drove to the cemetery with a bouquet of lilies, her favorite flowers. The sky was gray, the kind of overcast that makes the world feel muted and heavy. As I walked toward her headstone, I felt a lump rise in my throat. There it was, etched in polished granite. Laura Elizabeth Sanders, beloved wife and mother, 1969 to 2023. I knelt down and placed the flowers at the base of the headstone, brushing away some leaves that had gathered there. For a moment, I just stared at her name, unsure of what to say. "I don't even know if you can hear me," I began, my voice shaky. But I guess that doesn't matter. I need to say this for me. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the past few weeks pressing down on me. I'm angry, Laura. I'm hurt. I can't stop thinking about what you did, what we lost because of it. But I'm also trying to understand. I've read your letter a dozen times. I've read your journal. I know you felt like I wasn't there for you, and maybe you were right. Maybe I failed you in ways I didn't even realize. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves around me. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the cool air wash over my face. But you failed me too, I said softly. You didn't give me a chance to fix things. You made that choice for both of us, and now I'm left with all these questions you'll never answer. It's not fair, Laura. None of this is fair. I sat there in silence for a while, my thoughts swirling. Finally, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the folded piece of paper I'd brought with me. It was the letter I'd written to her in the notebook. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive you, I said, unfolding the letter and smoothing it out. But I'm going to try. For me, for the kids, for everything we built together. I placed the letter on the headstone, tucking it under one of the lilies to keep it from blowing away. I hope you found peace, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Because I'm still looking for mine. As I stood up and walked back to my car, I felt lighter somehow, like I'd left a piece of the burden behind. The pain was still there, but for the first time, it felt like something I could carry instead of something that would crush me. 2 days after my visit to Laura's grave, life started to feel marginally less suffocating. I was going through the motions, work, errands, trying to be present for the kids, but the weight of everything hadn't entirely lifted. Still, there was a flicker of normalcy creeping back in, like a fragile thread stitching the pieces of my life together. That thread snapped unexpectedly at the grocery store. I was standing in the cereal aisle, debating between Frosted Flakes and some overly virtuous granola, when I heard someone say, "Mark?" I turned, and my stomach dropped. It was Kathy, Laura's old colleague. Her expression was a mix of surprise and discomfort, like she hadn't expected to run into me, but couldn't just walk away. She had a basket in one hand, filled with fresh produce and a bottle of wine, and her other hand hovered uncertainly, like she didn't know whether to wave or not. "Kathy," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "I'm so sorry," she said quickly, stepping closer. "I didn't mean to startle you. How are you doing?" It was such a loaded question, one I didn't know how to answer. "I'm managing," I said finally. "One day at a time." She nodded, her face softening. "That's all you can do." For a moment, we just stood there, the awkwardness thick in the air. I thought about walking away, but something stopped me. "Can I ask you something?" I said, my voice low. "Of course," she said, her expression turning serious. "Did you know?" I asked, the question tumbling out before I could stop it. "About Laura and Kevin?" Kathy's face fell, and she looked down at the floor, her grip tightening on the handle of her basket. "I suspected," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I didn't know for sure until later." "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked, the hurt creeping into my voice. She looked up at me, her eyes full of guilt. "It wasn't my place, Mark. And honestly, I didn't know how. I didn't want to ruin your marriage. Or our friendship." I nodded slowly, trying to absorb her words. "I guess I understand," I said, though I wasn't sure if I truly did. "I'm so sorry," she said again, her voice trembling. "Laura." She wasn't herself during that time. I think she was struggling more than she let on. "But she loved you, Mark. She really did. She talked about you all the time, about how much she wanted to make things right." Hearing those words again, the same ones Kevin had said, made something inside me twist. "I don't know if that makes it better or worse," I said honestly. Kathy reached out, her hand briefly touching my arm. "If you ever want to talk about anything, I'm here," she said softly. I managed a small smile, though it felt forced. "Thanks, Kathy." She nodded, gave me one last look of sympathy, and walked away. As I stood there alone in the cereal aisle, I realized something. I wasn't angry at Kathy. Not really. She was just another person caught in the messy web of my life, trying to do the best she could with what she knew. And maybe that's all any of us could do. After my run-in with Kathy, I couldn't stop replaying the conversation in my head. Her words, "She wasn't herself during that time," stuck with me. It was becoming a pattern. Kevin, her journal. Now Kathy, all painting the same picture. Laura as someone who loved me but had lost her way. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with a blank sheet of paper in front of me. For weeks, I'd been swimming in a sea of emotions, but I hadn't tried to put them into any kind of order. It was time to untangle the knots, to make sense of the chaos. I started by listing everything I knew. Laura cheated on me with Kevin for over a year. She ended the affair and never told me while she was alive. She carried guilt for years, enough to leave me a confession in her final days. People who knew her, Kevin and Kathy, insisted she loved me. Then I wrote down the questions that had been haunting me. Can you truly love someone and betray them? Was I to blame for what happened? Did she keep it from me to protect me, or to protect herself? What do I do with all this now? By the time I finished, the page was a mess of scribbled thoughts, arrows pointing to connections, and questions I knew I might never answer. But seeing it all laid out in front of me helped. It was like taking the jumble of feelings in my chest and giving them a place to exist outside of myself. I realized I'd been holding on to the idea that if I just dug deep enough, I'd find a single, clean truth, a way to make sense of everything Laura had done and how I felt about it. But life wasn't clean, and neither was love. For years, I'd thought of Laura as my rock, the person who grounded me no matter what. I'd put her on a pedestal, thinking she could never do something like this. But now I saw her differently, not as a perfect partner, but as a flawed human being who made a terrible mistake. That night, I finally let myself cry, not the angry tears of betrayal, but the grief of losing someone I still loved despite everything. It was messy and cathartic, and when I finally stopped, I felt lighter, like I'd released something I didn't need to carry anymore. I didn't have all the answers, and I probably never would. But I had clarity about one thing. I didn't have to forgive Laura today, or tomorrow, or ever, if I wasn't ready. But I could choose to stop letting her mistake define me. As I turned off the kitchen light and headed to bed, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Hope. The following weekend, I decided to tackle the attic. It wasn't just about cleaning. I needed a distraction, something to keep my hands busy while my mind churned through the whirlwind of emotions I was still navigating. The attic was a treasure trove of forgotten memories, boxes of old toys, photo albums, and the random junk you accumulate over 25 years of marriage. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, but as I opened one dusty box, something caught my eye. It was a small, velvet-covered notebook, different from the leather journal I'd already found. My breath hitched as I opened it, unsure of what I'd find. The first page made my heart stop. A letter to myself. What I've learned and what I want to remember. It wasn't a journal exactly. It was more like a collection of thoughts, reflections, and affirmations. As I flipped through it, I realized Laura had written it in the years after her affair. One entry, dated 2 years after she ended things with Kevin, stood out. I'm trying to forgive myself. I can't change what I did, but I can choose to be better. I want to focus on my family, on Mark, on the life we've built. I'm lucky he doesn't know. Lucky I still have a chance to make things right. I'll spend the rest of my life earning it. I sat down on an old wooden chair, the notebook trembling in my hands. Page after page, she wrote about her love for me, her gratitude for our family, and her determination to move forward. She talked about how she tried to make up for her mistakes in ways I never even noticed, little things like planning special date nights, taking on extra work so I could relax, or simply being more present when we were together. I didn't know whether to feel comforted or crushed. The notebook painted a picture of a woman who was deeply flawed but desperately trying to atone. It didn't absolve her of what she'd done, but it reminded me of the Laura I'd known in the years after her affair. The Laura who was patient, kind, and fiercely devoted to our family. And then I found the final entry, dated just a few months before her cancer diagnosis. I still think about telling Mark the truth. He deserves to know, but I'm so afraid of losing him. I don't know if he could forgive me, and I can't bear the thought of breaking his heart. Maybe it's selfish, but I'd rather carry this burden alone. My hands tightened around the edges of the notebook. For weeks, I'd been furious at Laura for not telling me sooner, but now I saw a glimpse of her fear, her self-imposed penance. She hadn't told me because she was trying to protect me, or at least, that's what she'd convinced herself. I didn't know whether to feel betrayed or moved. When I finally closed the notebook, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the attic. I felt like I'd just lived an entire lifetime in the span of an hour, but one thought stood out above all the others. Laura had been carrying this weight for so long, trying to make things right in the only way she knew how. Maybe she'd failed. Maybe she hadn't. But I couldn't deny that she'd tried. For the first time, I felt a sliver of forgiveness start to take root. The discovery of Laura's second notebook gave me a lot to think about. It didn't erase the betrayal, but it added layers to her story, layers that softened some of my anger. I started to see her not just as the woman who'd wronged me, but as someone who had been deeply flawed, deeply human, and trying, in her own way, to fix what she'd broken. It was after reading that notebook for the third time that I realized I needed to talk to Olivia and Jacob. I'd wrestled for weeks with whether or not to tell them the truth. The idea of shattering their memories of their mother terrified me, but keeping this from them felt dishonest. If Laura had left the letter for me, wasn't it my responsibility to decide how much of the truth they should know? So I called them both and asked if they could come over for dinner. They didn't suspect anything out of the ordinary. Olivia even teased me about trying to make pasta again after last week's culinary disaster. When they arrived, we ate together in the dining room, laughter filling the space for the first time in what felt like forever. But as we cleared the plates, my nerves kicked in. "Can we sit for a bit?" I asked, my voice unsteady. They exchanged curious glances but nodded. I sat down, taking a deep breath before I began. "There's something I need to talk to you both about. It's about your mom." Their faces changed instantly. Olivia's brow furrowed, and Jacob leaned forward, his easygoing expression replaced with concern. "What is it, Dad?" Olivia asked. I hesitated, searching for the right words. "Before your mom passed, she left me a letter. In it, she told me about something that happened a long time ago, something she kept hidden for years." They didn't say anything, but I could see the tension in their bodies as they braced for whatever was coming next. "She had an affair," I said, my voice breaking slightly. "It was when you two were very young. It ended long before either of you would have noticed, and she never told me about it until now." The silence that followed was deafening. Olivia's face was a mix of shock and disbelief. Jacob looked down at his hands, his jaw tightening. "Why are you telling us this now?" Olivia asked, her voice trembling. "Because I didn't want to keep it from you," I said. "I've been wrestling with whether or not to say anything, but I realized that this isn't just my story to carry. It's part of who your mom was, part of our family's history. You deserve to know." Jacob finally spoke, his voice low and measured. How do you feel about it?" I sighed. "I've been angry, hurt, but I've also been trying to understand. Your mom was a complicated person. She made mistakes, but she spent years trying to make up for them in her own way. She loved you both fiercely, and I believe she loved me too, even though she did this." Olivia looked like she was about to cry. How could she do that? She always seemed so perfect." "She wasn't perfect," I said gently. "None of us are. But that doesn't mean she didn't love us or that the good memories we have of her aren't real." Jacob nodded slowly. "I guess I get that, but it's still a lot." "I know," I said, "and you don't have to process it all at once. Take your time. Ask me anything. I just want to be honest with you both, because I don't want this secret hanging over us." We sat together for a long time after that, talking through the shock, the hurt, and the confusion. It wasn't easy, and there were tears, but by the end of the night, I felt like a weight had been lifted. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was carrying this burden alone. That in the days after I told Olivia and Jacob, I noticed a shift in myself. I wasn't waking up every morning with that heavy, crushing feeling in my chest. The anger I'd carried for weeks had dulled into something quieter, a kind of lingering sadness, but not the consuming kind. Talking to my kids had been the right choice. It was hard, yes, but it gave us a new kind of closeness, one built on honesty and resilience. Olivia called me more often, checking in not just on me, but on how I was handling my emotions. Jacob swung by every few days, offering his calm presence without pressing too hard. And slowly, I began to heal. One evening, I found myself flipping through old photo albums again. This time, the pictures didn't sting the way they had before. Instead, they felt like windows into a life that was still worth cherishing, even if it wasn't as perfect as I'd once believed. There was one photo that stopped me, a picture of Laura and me at a beach, arms around each other, laughing as the wind tossed her hair into her face. I remembered that day vividly. It was just a few months after her affair had ended, though I hadn't known it at the time. I stared at her face in the photo, trying to reconcile the woman in it with the Laura I now knew. And for the first time, I didn't feel anger. Instead, I felt gratitude. Gratitude for the years we'd had together, for the memories we'd made, for the love that, despite everything, had been real. That weekend, I went back to the cemetery. This time, I brought a letter and knew one. It wasn't angry or accusatory. It was a goodbye. Laura, I've spent so much time trying to understand why you did what you did. And while I may never fully understand, I think I've finally made peace with it. You were human, just like me. You made mistakes, and so did I. But I believe you loved me. I believe you loved us. I'll never forget the pain your choices caused. But I also won't let it overshadow the good. We had a life together, a family, and that's what I'll hold on to. Thank you for loving me, even when it was messy. Thank you for the memories, the laughter, and the lessons. I hope you found peace, because I think I'm starting to find mine. I folded the letter and tucked it next to her headstone, under a new bouquet of lilies. As I walked back to my car, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm, golden light over the cemetery. For the first time since I'd read her letter, I felt like I could breathe again. Life would never be the same, but it would go on. And I was ready to face it, that if there's one thing I've learned from this experience, it's that love is never as simple as we want it to be. People are messy, complicated, and flawed, but that doesn't mean the love they give isn't real. Forgiveness isn't something you can rush. It's a process, one that takes time and a lot of soul-searching. For anyone out there grappling with betrayal, my advice is this: don't bury your feelings. Sit with them, wrestle with them, and let yourself grieve. But also remember that life doesn't stop at heartbreak. There's always room for healing, for growth, and for new beginnings. And if you can, choose to let love, even imperfect love, leave its mark.